If you grew up in the 80s and 90s here in the US, then you probably remember Pizza Day at school. For me, it was always on Fridays. And it wasn't just any pizza, but the iconic rectangular pizza that I'll be making today using the original recipe from 1988. So thank you to my Patreon patrons for keeping me flush with ideas for this channel as we go back to middle school for Pizza Day, this time on Tasting History. So I don't usually cover history from the 80s and 90s or anything that recent here on the channel, but when somebody posted on the Tasting History Reddit page the original recipe for this pizza that I so loved in elementary and middle school, I decided that I just had to make it. So this is an episode of Tasting My History. So the recipe comes from a 1988 booklet which was distributed to schools all over the US called Quantity Recipes for School Food Service from the United States Department of Agriculture. And it has recipes for all of your late 20th century school favorites like instant mashed potatoes, sloppy joes, or Salisbury steak, children.
It's Salisbury steak day.
But my favorite was the square pizza, or really rectangular pizza. And there are a few variations when it comes to how they made this pizza, the first being the crust. For pizza dough, use pizza crust recipe, see B14, or pourable pizza crust recipe, see B15. Pourable pizza crust, you say? Well, I am intrigued. Now, I don't know if my lunch lady used this recipe or if she did the regular pizza crust, but I want to make pourable pizza crust, so that's what I'm going to do. Now, the recipe calls for 100 servings. I don't need 100 servings of pizza, so I'm going to reduce it to 10 servings of pizza, for which you will need 2½ teaspoons or 7 grams of active dry yeast, 1 2/3 cup or 375 milliliters of warm water, 110 degrees Fahrenheit, 2½ cups or 320 grams of all-purpose or bread flour, 3/4 of a cup or 55 grams of instant non-fat dry milk, 2 tablespoons or 25 grams of sugar, a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, 1½ teaspoons of vegetable oil plus more for greasing the pan, and 1½ tablespoons or 15 grams of cornmeal. So first dissolve the dry yeast into the water and let it sit for 5 minutes. While it sits, add the flour, dry milk, sugar, and salt in a stand mixer and mix using the whisk attachment on low for 4 minutes. I'm not sure exactly why it has you whisk it for so long at this point since there is no liquid in it yet, but that's what the recipe says, so that's what I'm doing. After 4 minutes, add the yeast, which should be nice and frothy, and the vegetable oil to the dough, or actually it calls it a batter, and continue to mix on a medium speed for 10 minutes. And while it mixes, you can get your pan ready. Now the recipe actually calls for 5 sheet pans, but sheet pans are actually massive. They're not going to fit in a home oven. So the ones that we use at home, even the large ones, are half sheet pans. So that's what I'm going to use, and I'm only going to use one of them, which will be for 10 servings. So coat the half sheet pan in a little more oil, and then sprinkle the top with cornmeal, trying to get it evenly distributed. Once the batter is ready, pour it into the pan and spread it out to cover the base. Now I really thought I screwed up here because there is no way that this amount of dough was going to cover the bottom of the pan, but I left it for a couple of minutes and it sort of relaxed and I eventually had a nice thin layer of dough all over. That's probably why the recipe says to let the dough sit for 20 minutes while you preheat your oven to 475 degrees Fahrenheit or 425 if you are using a convection oven. That's 245 degrees or 218 degrees Celsius for those of you not living in the US or in the other handful of countries that still uses Fahrenheit. I see you, my friends, in the Federated States of Micronesia. So once the dough is sat for 20 minutes, set it in the oven and bake for 10 minutes or 7 minutes if you are using convection. Now at this point the dough should be pre-baked. It's not fully baked through, but it's going to have some more time in the oven once we've added our toppings. And when it comes to toppings, we have a couple of options. There is the pizza with cheese topping and one for pizza with ground beef topping. Now maybe my school never had the ground beef topping, or maybe I just never got it. I can't honestly remember, but I do only remember eating this as a cheese pizza, so that's the one that I'm going to make. So for that, what you'll need is 1 tablespoon and 2 teaspoons or 12 grams of dried onions, a half teaspoon of garlic powder, a 1/4 teaspoon of black pepper, a half cup plus 2 tablespoons or 160 grams of tomato paste, 1 1/3 cups or 330 milliliters of water, 2 teaspoons dried basil, 2 teaspoons dried oregano, 1 1/2 teaspoons dried marjoram, a half teaspoon dried thyme, and 5 1/4 cups or 565 grams of mozzarella cheese shredded. If you do want to make the ground beef version, then just cut the amount of cheese in half and replace it with just under a pound of ground beef that you cook before putting it onto the pizza. But for the cheese version, you start by mixing the onions, garlic powder, pepper, tomato paste, water, and the seasonings in a saucepan, and then bring it to a simmer on the stove, and let it simmer for about 10 minutes. While it simmers, spread 1½ cups of the cheese over the pizza crust, and then once the sauce has simmered for 10 minutes, pour that over the cheese, smoothing it out evenly. Again, it didn't really seem that there was going to be enough sauce, but there was, though as I spread it, I sort of messed up the cheese, and it seems that this was actually a problem even back in 1988, because in later recipes from the 90s, they just have you add that 1.5 cups of cheese to the sauce before putting it on. It probably makes it a lot easier. Once the tomato sauce is spread to the edges of the pan, sprinkle the remaining cheese evenly over the top. Now, if you recall, these pizzas did not have a crust around the edge like a round pizza, so you want to get the cheese all the way to the edge of the pan. Then pop that in the oven at 475 degrees Fahrenheit, 450 if you're using convection, and let it bake until it is lightly browned on top. The original recipe says it should bake for 15 to 18 minutes, but for me that was going to be way too long. It only took about 11 minutes to get brown on top, and I think that's just because I'm making 1/10 of the original quantity, so just keep an eye on it. Now, there are two other interesting things in this booklet that I wanted to share. First are the garnishes. It gives instructions on how to make carrot ribbons or curls, celery fans, radish roses, onion mums, radish tulips, or a tomato rose. And personally, I don't ever remember my lunch lady making us any radish roses. And frankly, I think it's kind of unfair to expect an already very busy lunch lady or lunch man to make radish roses for a bunch of 6-year-olds. Kind of a waste of time, but if they did that at your school, let me know. The other interesting bit is that after each recipe, it tells you how much each serving of the dish equals servings of meat, vegetable, and bread. Like when it comes to our cheese pizza, not the meat pizza, but the cheese pizza, one piece provides the equivalent of 2 ounces of cooked lean meat, 1/4 cup of vegetable, and 2 servings of bread. And that's really what school lunch was all about. It was making sure that the kids got enough servings of meat, vegetable, and bread, or nutrients in general. Or at least that was the goal, though it didn't always happen, as can be seen by the lunches of the late 20th century. Last year I did a video on the history of school lunch, and it focused mostly on the history pre-1960. So I decided that this would be a good chance to fill in some of the gaps post-1960. And the first thing that I found actually came from a comment left on that video about how the Black Panther Party influenced the school breakfast program. See, in the late 1960s, a study came out showing that kids who didn't have breakfast didn't do as well in school. They were tired, they would fall asleep, they couldn't concentrate. Kind of makes perfect sense, enough that you wouldn't even think you'd need a study to show you that, but they did. And it also showed that most of these kids were in poorer neighborhoods where they didn't have breakfast in the morning, usually because they couldn't afford it. So in 1969, the Black Panther Party started a program at a church in Oakland, California that provided free breakfasts to children who needed them. That first day, there were only 11 kids that showed up, but by the end of that first week, 135 kids were participating every day. The success of the program was so great that the party decided that they would have all of their chapters repeat it. So this breakfast program that the Black Panthers were doing was happening all over the country, and it got really, really big. So big that it grabbed the attention of the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, who hated the Black Panthers. He hated pretty much everything. And this program that gave children free breakfast was so successful that Hoover decided it needed to be stopped. The program represents the best and most influential activity going for the BPP, and as such is potentially the greatest threat to efforts by authorities to neutralize the BPP and destroy what it stands for. Nice guy, that J. Edgar. He began a campaign that spread rumors that the Black Panthers were poisoning the breakfasts, and that didn't work. So instead, he just had police go in and bust the places up, destroying all of the food before it could be served to the kids. Unfortunately, it was effective, and it led to the program being discontinued and breaking up. But it had already become so popular that it couldn't go away. That program went away, but the kids' desire for breakfasts did not. So it gave a big boost to another program that had already been in effect since 1966 but hadn't really taken off. And that was a government-run program called the School Breakfast Program, which Congress permanently authorized in 1975. Though it also came under fire only 6 years later when big budget cuts hit the government, and it did stick around and is still around today, but even today it remains a political football. But it was during these budget cuts early on in the Reagan administration that led to another rather infamous lunch claim that the government was going to consider ketchup a vegetable. Now, how this came about was that during discussions at the USDA about how they could keep kids fed in light of these budget cuts to the school lunch program, they had a meeting where ideas could be freely tossed around. Anything goes. It was kind of one of those meetings where it's like, just say what you're thinking, there are no bad ideas. Well, one person had the idea to change the nutrition standards a little bit, which would allow relish and ketchup to be considered a vegetable. Now, that was a bad idea, and unfortunately somebody wrote it down and it didn't get removed. Now, it never actually became policy, but the whole ketchup is a vegetable thing did get out into the public, and there was severe blowback, rightly so. As one senator criticized, "This is one of the most ridiculous regulations I ever heard of, and I suppose I need not add that I do know something about ketchup and relish, or did at one time." And the reason he says that he knows something about ketchup and relish is that that senator was Henry J. Heinz III of the Heinz ketchup family. But officially, the government never actually considered ketchup to be a vegetable. That is not to say that there were not other dubious claims made to the school lunch program. Going back all the way to 1975, there was a pilot program started first in Las Vegas, and then that spread to New York, Milwaukee, and several other cities, where schools began changing their lunch menus to more mimic the fast food that was becoming popular with the students. This led to menus with beef and cheese tacos, cheese pizzas, a meat and bean-filled burrito, a corn dog, fried chicken, and all-beef hamburger. Hard-boiled eggs, cottage cheese, and a chef's salad are also available. They also had a new alternative to milk, which the USDA signed off on as an approved alternative to milk, and it was called the Super Shake, which was essentially a milkshake, but they didn't use ice cream. But it did use emulsifiers and stabilizers that impart the creamy texture. The finished shakes are 96.75% fat-free, which would not be possible if they were made with ice cream. To meet the requirement of kids needing to have a vegetable on their plate, they gave the children two options: a salad or French fries. And not shocking to anyone, the number of students choosing salad over fries has to be considered negligible. The thing is, these were actually the healthy meals. These were the meals that hit all the standards that would allow them to be reimbursed by the US government. But there were other meals being offered that did not meet these standards. And so many students were seen taking lunches such as 2 cinnamon buns and a Coke, 4 sugar cookies and Sprite, 2 bags of French fries and a milkshake, or simply a glass of soda. And yet, even with these criticisms, the Las Vegas high school lunch was superior to most of the 135 sampled around the country several years ago. But neither the fast foodification of the 1970s nor the budget cuts of the 1980s would compare to what happened to school lunches in the 1990s, when I was eating them. See, in the 1970s, they tried to mimic the fast food of the time. But in the 1990s, new regulations were put in that let the fast food companies just come right on into the schools. There were branded products from McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, Pizza Hut, you name it, it was there. Now, not every school had this. My school never did, and at the time, we kids did not like that. But in hindsight, probably a good thing. But by the year 2000, 1 out of 5 schools in the US had some of these branded products. Now, it does seem that the late 90s and early 2000s were kind of the worst period nutritionally for American school lunches, with about 35% of the calories coming from fat. But eventually, schools began to fight back. Even when I was in high school, there was a push to get rid of the vending machines, and they either got rid of them while I was there or just after, I can't really remember. Anyway, in the last couple of decades, there has been an effort to make school lunches here in the US more nutritious, and in some places they certainly have. But it is still definitely a point of contention and political debate. But that is food present, and I am all about food history. So let us travel back in time to 1988, when a 5-year-old Max walked into Madison Heights Elementary to try his first slice of square pizza. So once your pizza has baked, take it out of the oven and cut it into slices. I had planned on doing 10 slices, but it turns out cutting that into 10 was going to be kind of wonky, so I cut them into 9. And here we are, school lunch from 1988. So it smells just like it did 30 some odd years ago. Let's see if it tastes that way too. Memories from the corners of my mind. That's my best Barbra Streisand. Tastes just like it. You can, like, all of those herbs are exactly the same as they were. I think maybe it tastes a little fresher than I remember. Like, the flavors are a little heightened, but that's them. This is the pizza. And that's the dough. That pourable dough. That must be what they were using at my school, because that is the dough. I also love that today I would never think of drinking chocolate milk with pizza, but in middle school, I always had chocolate milk with pizza. They were smaller. I searched for a carton that was smaller, and I couldn't find it. I was told by my sister, who recently stopped teaching elementary school, that her school still has the little cartons, and that I should just go to an elementary school and ask for a carton, but I thought that might be weird, so I got a big one. It's good. Still goes with pizza. I should have made all 100 slices. So if you are nostalgic for this pizza, might I suggest you make it? It's pretty cool to taste this flavor, because I don't think they make it anymore, at least not like this at schools. And kudos to all of the lunch ladies and lunch men out there today and from my past. They do the good work. Oh, also something that my sister reminded me of about the chocolate milk. Does anyone else remember there was a period of like 1 or 2 years in many schools where they switched from the cartons to these bags of milk, either regular or chocolate milk, and it was like a clear bag. It was like a bladder of milk. It was kind of gross. You just stuck the straw in like a Capri Sun, but on its side. Does anyone remember that? Because I remember it, she remembers it, but none of our friends seem to. So we were thinking maybe we were crazy. Anyway, let me know in the comments, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. Pop quiz hotshot. What's the Pope's favorite pizza topping? I actually don't know. But in 1570, it might have been rose water and sugar. And that's what we're making today, a 16th century Italian pizza served in the papal court, which calls for exactly those ingredients. So thank you to Bright Cellars for sponsoring this video as we slice into the history of pizza, this time on Tasting History. So this recipe comes from the Opera di Bartolomeo Scappi, which I did an entire episode on, and I'll put a link up here in the corner so you can watch it, or I'll put one in the description as well. The entire book is filled with recipes that are quintessentially Italian Renaissance, that kind of mixture of sweet and spice that our palate might just be like, what? And this one is no different. Per fare pizza sfogliata ad un altro modo. Another way to prepare flaky pizza. Bring together 3 pounds of fine flour and 2 ounces of yeast starter, 4 ounces of breadcrumb that is soaked in warm water, and enough salt. When the dough is made, let it rest, covered in a warm place to rise, as is done with bread. Then knead it again on the table for a half hour, adding in little by little 2 pounds of fresh butter. Knead until all of the butter has been worked into the dough and it has become soft. Split the dough up into 2 or 3 pieces, and with each piece, make the pizza in a torte pan which has fresh butter in it. Bake it in an oven with melted butter on top. Make several holes on top with the tip of a knife so it will not puff up too much. When it is nearly done, sprinkle with sugar and rose water. This pastry should be baked slowly and serve it hot. So does that sound at all like a pizza to you? No, not really, but frankly, the definition of pizza is kind of weird. I mean, look at Chicago-style pizza. It's basically soup. Anyway, for this recipe, what you'll need is 4 cups or 480 grams of bread flour, a 1/4 cup or 60 grams of high yeast biga. This will need to have a much higher yeast and flour content than your typical sourdough starter, so it might take you a little while to make that or just add in more yeast. If you just want to use dried yeast, I'd use about a teaspoon. 6 tablespoons or 60 grams of breadcrumbs soaked in 1 cup or 120 milliliters of warm water. An additional 1/2 cup of water. 2 teaspoons of salt. 1 pound or 400 grams of unsalted butter cut into pieces. So usually during Scappi's time, butter would have a lot of salt in it, more than we'd be used to, but he specifically in this recipe calls for fresh butter. So my thought is that he's not adding the salt because the salt was added as a preservative. I don't know that, but he also calls out salt individually in the recipe, so we're doing unsalted butter and just adding salt where we need. 2 tablespoons of melted butter, 1 tablespoon of sugar, and 1 teaspoon of rose water. Now you'll notice that these are not the exact quantities that Scappi called for because he must be making a pizza to feed, well, the entire papal court, which he probably was. I cut everything in half, and it's still a lot of dough. So first, whisk the salt into the flour, then add your yeast and soaked breadcrumbs, and then mix everything together. Then add in the additional 1/2 cup of water, but only as much as you need to make it form a dough. This dough ends up being super sticky once you add in all of the butter, so don't add any more water than you need to get it to come together. If you need to add more later on, you can, but it's gonna be real sticky. Then knead the dough for about 10 minutes until the dough starts to smooth out. Then put it in a lightly greased bowl and cover, allowing it to double in size. Once the dough is risen, punch it down and turn it out onto a lightly floured surface. Stretch it into a square or rectangle and scatter a few pieces of butter on top, then fold it over to cover the butter. Then knead it until the butter is fully incorporated. Then do this again, and again, and again until all of the butter is incorporated. Pro tip, use a stand mixer if you got it. Also, as you add butter into this dough, it is going to get super sticky. And if it becomes too sticky to work with, which it probably will at some point, just add some more flour. 1 or 2 tablespoons at a time, just to keep it, in dough form rather than like liquid butter form.
Fattening.
Once all the butter is incorporated and the dough is silky smooth, divide it into 3 pieces, then let it rest preferably in the refrigerator for about a half an hour. And while you wait, preheat your oven to 350 Fahrenheit or 175 Celsius. Then butter the bottom and the sides of a large pie or cake pan. It's going to work best if you have one of those false bottom cake pans. It's just easier to get out, but you don't need it. What you do want to use is the biggest frickin' pan that you can find, because even halved, which is what I'm doing, this recipe calls for a lot of dough. You can also half what I'm doing, which is a quarter of what Scappi's doing, because, I mean, if you don't have a 10-inch cake pan, which is what I used, half it. Once the dough is rested, roll it into discs the diameter of the pan and form the pizza by layering the dough pieces in the pan on top of each other. Then top it all off by brushing on a layer of melted butter. Then, using a knife, poke some holes all over the top to keep it from puffing up too much. Then set the pizza on a lined baking sheet and bake for 1 hour and 15 minutes. Now that is a long bake time, but it's because it's a lot of frickin' dough. But that gives me time to top off my glass of wine and tell you how we got from this pizza to this pizza. So when tracking the history of pizza, we really have to figure out where to start, because if your idea of pizza is just some flatbread with stuff on it, then the ancient Greeks, Egyptians, and Indians had pizza. But I don't consider naan with some oil on it pizza. In the 6th century BC, Persian soldiers under Darius the Great baked flatbread on their shields and put cheese and dates on top. Closer, but pizza? I mean, they didn't call it pizza, and frankly, if you're gonna call that pizza, then you have to call pancakes that have syrup and berries on it pizza, and then where do you draw the line? Is tostada a pizza?
No, I don't think so.
Well, then when does pizza become a thing? Well, the very first mention of pizza using the word pizza comes from 997 in Gaeta, Italy. It was found in a contract between Bernardo, the son of Duke Marino II, and the Bishop of Gaeta. And basically, if Bernardo wanted to use the bishop's mill, then every year on Christmas Day, you and your heirs must pay us 12 pizze, 12 pizzas. And similarly, 12 pizzas and a couple of chickens on the day of Holy Easter of Resurrection. So even before our papal pizza today, bishops were eating it. Very popular dish amongst the clergy. Now, the first recipe for something called pizza comes from 1524 in the Manoscritto Lucano. And then, some years later, in 1570, we have 5 pizza recipes in Bartolomeo Scapi's opera, which we are making one of today. Scapi is also the first mention of that link between Naples and pizza. To prepare a torte with various ingredients called pizza by Neapolitans. Though some of the ingredients include pine nuts, dates, figs, raisins, and cinnamon, none of which are available at Domino's. Maybe at Papa John's, though. Now, that connection between Naples and pizza is very important because Naples is often credited with being the birthplace of what we know as pizza today. But it was not papal pizza like we are making today. It is poor people pizza. It was a food for the poor, or the lazzarone, as Alexandre Dumas said. And he didn't seem to hold them in high regard. But the pizza that they were eating sounds a lot more like what we would know as pizza today. The lazzarone usually eats 2 things: pizza and watermelon. Pizza is round in shape and is kneaded from the same dough as bread. It comes in different widths depending on the price. A 2-farthing pizza is enough for a man, a 2 penny should fill a whole family. The pizza is with oil, the pizza is with bacon, the pizza is with lard, the pizza is with cheese, the pizza is with tomatoes, the pizza is with small fish. The word pizza has lost all meaning at this point in the video. Now, he mentions cheese and tomatoes, and those, I would think, are pretty important to pizza today. And for more on the amazing history of tomatoes specifically, you should watch this video up here, I'll put it in the description, on the history of tomatoes, aka the badass name Wolf Peach. It's a really good video. Now, the Lazzarone mostly ate these pizzas on weekdays as they saved up their money so they could buy macaroni on Sundays, though macaroni did not necessarily look like macaroni as we think of it. And if you still had trouble saving up enough, then you could get a discount pizza if you were fine with day-old pizza, which I usually am. Dumas even says, there are week-old pizzas for those with small purses. These can, if not pleasantly, at least advantageously replace seafood biscuits. Week-old pizza? Before refrigerators?
The cheese is old and moldy.
I'm guessing it was one of these pizzas that prompted Samuel Morse, the inventor of the telegraph, to describe pizza as a species of most nauseating cake, covered over with slices of pomodoro or tomatoes, and sprinkled with little fish and black pepper, and I know not what other ingredients. It altogether looks like a piece of bread that had been taken reeking out of the sewer. That was probably just a piece of Chicago-style deep dish. Ooh, fighting words. Now, in general, the pizza was not looked on with high regard, and Dumas even says, you can't eat a pizza without risking suffocation. Was Dumas a drama queen or severely gluten intolerant? You decide. Though I do wonder if Dumas actually mixed up this week-old pizza with pizza a otto, which was basically you got fresh pizza today, but you had to pay for it 8 days later, like layaway or the payday lenders of 19th century Naples. Now, these pizzas tended to be small, kind of personal-sized pizzas that were sold on the streets by street vendors, though there were some more reputable locations where you could eat pizza, including a tavern that was founded in the 18th century called Pizzeria di Pietro e Basta Così, which translates roughly to the most stereotypically Italian-sounding name ever. Peter's Pizza Place, and that's enough. How great is that? And it is in this shop, later renamed Pizzeria Brandi, where we get pizza's most famous origin story. It's probably, well, it's definitely not completely true. It's probably somewhat true, but here it is. In 1889, Umberto I, king of a recently unified Italy, and his wife, Queen Margherita, decided to branch out from the French cuisine of the palace, and headed to Naples, where they commissioned Raffaele Esposito, the then owner of Pizzeria Brandi, to make 3 pizzas. One with lard, one with fish, and one with basil, tomato, and fresh mozzarella. Queen Margherita tried the first pizza and said, "This pizza is too fatty." She tried the second pizza and said, "This pizza is too fishy." Finally, she tried the third pizza, the one with mozzarella, tomato, and basil, and she said, "This pizza is just right." And thus was born the Pizza Margherita. It even had the three colori, or colors, of the Italian flag: green basil, white mozzarella, and red tomatoes. Again, probably not entirely true. Well, it's definitely not entirely true, but there might be some truth to it. But Naples says that this is how it happened, and the story is just too good not to accept without question. But even with the Queen on board, pizza still stayed a food of the poor, and thank God it did, because those were the people who brought it to America. In the late 19th and early 20th century, poor Italian immigrants brought pizza to the streets of New York City. Now, pizza was being sold all over the streets of New York, especially in Little Italy, but the first place that is credited with the first pizza, because they went and got a license, that's why, is called Lombardi's on Spring and Mott Street in Little Italy, and that is just 1 block from my first New York apartment. It was so small, great area, but it was so small that my bedroom door could not open all the way because I had a twin bed in there, and that got in the way. So, could you really call it a bedroom if it can't fit a bed? But pizza still really hadn't taken off outside of the Italian-American community. For that, we would have to go to war. When our brave boys returned home from fighting in Italy in WW2, they brought back a love of Italian food. And one of those Italian foods was pizza. It was the perfect food for the new suburban lifestyle. It could be made at home, or it could be made for delivery, and pizza places started popping up in cities all over the country. In 1958, Pizza Hut opened.
Pizza the Hut!
And in 1960, Tom and James Monahan bought the Michigan pizzeria Dominic's and changed the name to Domino's. This is also when frozen pizza was becoming popular, and I do love a frozen pizza. To this day, I cannot do Halloween. Halloween has to start with a Red Baron pizza. I do not know why, but every Halloween I eat myself an entire Red Baron pizza all by myself, just as I did when I was a little kid. I was a chubby kid. I was a big kid. I wore husky pants, but man, I do love a Red Baron pizza. I only do it once a year now, though. What's interesting is that back in Old Italy, pizza still hadn't really gotten out of Naples and a few other places like Sicily. But when American tourists started showing up in Italy and they wanted pizza and Pisa, the other parts of Italy had to step up and start making their own kinds of pizza. And it didn't go great at first. Some of the country was so bad at mimicking Neapolitan pizza that the city of Naples founded AVPN, or the Associazione Verace Pizza Napoletana, which laid the groundwork for what makes pizza pizza. But I think that it was a little too late. The cat was already out of the bag, because here in America we were making sushi pizza and pizza bagels, and we had really done whatever we want with pizza. Heck, you could even come over to my house later tonight and have yourself a pizza with rose water and sugar, because I'm pretty sure my pizza's about done. So at 1 hour and 15 minutes, open up the oven and quickly brush on the rose water and sprinkle with sugar. Then let it bake for another 15 minutes or until it's baked all the way through. And then your papal pizza is ready to eat. And here we are, Scappi's pizza from the Italian Renaissance. Now this is a real pizza work. So, it smells amazing. I mean, it smells like fresh, it kind of smells like croissants. I let it cool. You need to let it cool before you cut into it, because the butter needs so much butter. Here we go. Let's give this a taste. I don't think maybe it overrose, or I'm not sure. It's gonna be fine. That's delicious. It's not pizza. I mean, that's fantastic. The rose is so subtle. I didn't just taste some of the top. The rose is so subtle. It's there on the top. That's wonderful. Wow. I would make it thinner next time. I'd do like a half of my recipe. I really think that that's probably the way to go. This is nice, But oh my God, it's so much bread. You know, we're not gonna eat this. But, is it pizza? I mean, it's called pizza, but I think it would be like if somebody said, hey, are you a doctor? And I said, yes, I'm a doctor. And then they found out I'm a doctor of, you know, like the oboe performance or something like that. I mean, yeah, I'm a doctor, but I'm not a doctor. By the way, I'm not a doctor of anything, so that's just a story. But this is some really good pizza. Just, you know, don't tell your friends that it's pizza, they'll think you're crazy. Instead, tell them this is pizza, which is also delicious, and this is what I'm gonna have for dinner tonight. I'll see you next time on Tasting History. That's pizza. That's pizza. Cheesecake is one of those foods that no matter the style, it never disappoints. From the creamy New York style cheesecake to the burnt Basque cheesecake to the souffle style cheesecake of Japan. But how do they compare to the original cheesecake? This 2,000-year-old ancient Roman cheesecake known as savilum. So thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video as we have dessert in ancient Rome. This time on Tasting History. Today's recipe comes from De Agricultura, or On the Subject of Agriculture by Marcus Porcius Cato, better known as Cato the Elder. Cato, or Cato, however you want to say it, was a serious man to say the least. He was not the kind of guy who you would expect to ever even see smile, let alone indulging in cake. And yet, in his work on how to run a successful farm, he has an entire section completely dedicated to different cakes. He even has 3 recipes for cheesecake. And I liken these recipes to the 3 bears. There's one that's a bit too simple, one that is way too complex, and then one that is just right. The very simple one, known as libum, was basically just cheese and flour molded into a cake. It is a cake in the same way that, like, a urinal cake is a cake. It's the shape of a cake, and that's about it. It's not sweet, so it's not a dessert. The really complex one has the horrible name placenta, spelled like placenta, and that's actually where many years later we would get the word placenta. And I have made it here on the channel. It's very good, has lots of layers in it. It's just a lot of work for what is essentially cheese and honey. But the third recipe, known as savilum or savilum, depending on how you want to pronounce your Latin, is, to me, just right. Make the savilum this way. Take a ½ pound of flour and 2½ pounds of cheese and mix together as for the libum. Add a ¼ pound of honey and 1 egg. Grease an earthenware dish with oil. When you have mixed the ingredients well, pour into the dish and cover it with an earthenware lid. See that you cook it well in the middle where it is thickest. When it is cooked, remove the dish. Coat with honey, sprinkle with poppy seeds, and put it back beneath the lid for a short while, then remove it from the fire. Serve it in the dish with a spoon. Now, when modernizing this recipe, the first question that we have to ask is, how much does a pound weigh? Or rather, how much did a pound weigh in Cato the Elder's time? Well, in 268 BC, the libra, which is where we get the abbreviation LB for pound, was standardized, and today it would weigh 0.72 pounds or 329 grams. So instead of a ½ pound of flour and 2½ pounds of cheese, what you will actually need is 1¼ cup or 165 grams of whole wheat or barley flour, 3⅓ cup or 820 grams of cheese, and he's not specific in what kind of cheese you should use, so pretty much anything will work. I'm using ricotta because it's nice and mild, and it's pretty soft, though actually he probably would have been using a hard cheese, but you don't want a super salted cheese because that's going to just throw off the flavor. Then 1 egg, a ¼ cup or 80 grams of honey plus some additional honey for drizzling over the cake, and some poppy seeds. The common poppy seed at the time used in desserts, at least according to Pliny the Elder, was the white poppy, which when parched and mixed with honey used to be served up in the second course at the tables of the ancients. But he also talks about black poppy seeds, so I'm going to use a mixture of both. Though if you are using white poppy seeds, which I actually have never used until this recipe, it is best to toast them in a pan for about 10 to 15 seconds. So with just a handful of ingredients, our ancient Roman cheesecake shouldn't take very long to make. For our ancient Roman cheesecake, it's very, very simple. All you have to do is mix your cheese with your flour until everything is well combined. Then beat the egg and add it to the cheese mixture and stir. Finally, mix in the 1/4 cup of honey. Now, honey was the major sweetener for all of the people living in the ancient Mediterranean. Basically, honey, grape must, dates, figs, and fresh fruit were how they got all of their desserts sweet. They did know about sugarcane. It was being grown in India and as far west as Arabia in that period, but they only used it for medicine, and even then it was very sparingly. Now, once your honey is fully incorporated, coat a dish with a little olive oil and then pour the batter in. Now, the size of the dish is really up to you. About 9 inches in diameter will give you a thin cheesecake, but you can use a smaller dish for a deep cheesecake. Now, in the original recipe, it says to cover it, and that's referring to something called a pestum, which is essentially an ancient Roman clay Dutch oven. They would put it over a fire and then have a top on it, and they would put hot coals on top of that. But I don't have one of those, and I'm guessing you don't either, so you can use any kind of dish that has a lid. I'm going to use a tagine, but you could also just use a casserole dish. Frankly, if you made it without a cover at all, it would still probably work because you're putting it into an oven, so yeah, that works as well. Either way, put the entire thing in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 175 Celsius, and bake for 45 minutes to an hour. The length that it needs to bake is really going to depend on how deep you made your cheesecake. You want it to be done enough that when you put a toothpick into the center, it comes out fairly clean. At that point, you can immediately drizzle honey all over the top. Now, the amount is really up to you, how sweet you want your cake. I went with just enough to coat the top, but if you want a pool of honey, by all means, pool the honey. Then sprinkle the top with white and or black poppy seeds and cover the dish again, then set it back in the oven for about 10 minutes, then take it out and set it on a wire rack to cool completely. Now, like I said, this is just one of the 3 cheesecakes that Cato talks about. The very simple libum, which was basically just cheese and flour, that one was mostly used in religious ceremonies. It could be offered up to the gods, and it would be eaten afterward. Placenta was also probably used in religious ceremonies, but it definitely was served on tables at grand feasts. We can see it in different menus from the period. But this savilum is a little bit different because those 2 cakes could be served like you take the whole cake out and you give them the cake. But this one is meant to be served in the dish that it is cooked in. So unless you're asking the priest to give the cake dish back, which I guess you could, I'm curious, was it only used as a dessert, part of the secunda mensa, or the final part of an ancient Roman meal? Dinner in ancient Rome would really vary depending on your social status. For the majority of people, it was probably something simple like pulse, which is a sort of porridge. But should you have the means, well then it was a multi-course meal, or rather a multi-table meal. Because at least early on, the food was brought out on the table. That's why the 2 main courses were prima mensa and secunda mensa, literally meaning first table and second table. And for much of the early history of Rome, it does seem that it was just those 2 courses. But as the Republic evolved or devolved into empire, the courses had to expand. So when attending a grand feast in ancient Rome, you would likely start off with the promulsis, a course of hors d'oeuvres and aperitifs which became popular at least by the reign of Tiberius, Rome's second emperor. Unlike the rest of the meal, which was served on tables as you sat or rather reclined on couches, the promulsis was served standing up on like a buffet table of sorts. There'd be things like oysters, mushrooms, snails, marinated vegetables, and salsamentum, which are brined fish. If the gathering is a little more over the top, like Trimalchio's feast, which is described in Petronius's 1st century Satyricon, well then it would be these finger foods, but they would be arrayed in spectacular fashion. On the promulsis table stood a donkey made of Corinthian bronze bearing 2 baskets, black olives in one, green in the other. 2 plates flanked the figure. The weight in silver and Trimalchio's name were engraved upon each. Sitting on little bridges which were welded to the plates were dormice dipped in honey and sprinkled with poppy seed, and hot sausages on a silver grill, and beneath that were damson plums and pomegranate seeds. But really, the promulsis, like a cocktail hour today, was less about the finger foods and more about the libations. Drinks like the spiced wine Conditum Paradoxum, which I made a few years back, or the wormwood-infused vermouth, which I hope to make in the future, would be shared from a communal drinking vessel that was passed around. Though the most common drink for the course was known as mulsum, which was a drink derived from a mixture of either grape must or wine and honey. Pliny the Elder suggested that the best is that made from old wine. The honey is incorporated very easily. He says that while naturally you might think sweet wine is a better mixture with honey, it's actually the more biting wine that really does the job. Because made with astringent wine, it does not swell the stomach, and it causes less flatulence, the usual drawback of mulsum. And seeing as you drink this right at the beginning of a very long meal, less flatulence is probably a good thing. And another reason that it was a good thing to drink at the beginning of the meal is because it stimulates the appetite. Taken cold, it relaxes the stomach, and taken hot, it commonly tightens it. Now, seeing as it is basically a glass of sugar that you're drinking, Pliny does warn that it can cause weight gain. But many have reached a rather old age by eating nothing but bread and mulsum. A well-known example is Polion Romilius. He had passed his 100th year when the divine Augustus, his guest, asked him by what means he had preserved such vigor of mind and body. He answered, mulsum inside, oil outside. Following the promulsis, the guests would be seated, or rather reclined, onto the sofas, and the meal would truly begin with a course known as gustatio, and this was basically appetizers, and it could have some overlap with the first course, but it also almost always included an egg dish. This is actually where the ancient Roman phrase ab ovo usque ad mala, or from eggs to apples, comes from. It means from beginning to end because eggs began the meal and apples or other fruits ended the meal. It's kind of like the early 20th century phrase from soup to nuts, when meals started with soup and ended with nuts. Now, the egg dishes could be something as simple as just boiled eggs or even raw eggs, or something more complex like a patina. There are numerous patine recipes mentioned in De Re Coquinaria, attributed to the gourmand Apicius, and easily the most complete cookbook that we have from ancient Rome. A patina was a sort of omelet or quiche, and it was often flavored with either sweet things or more often different meats and seafood. Sometimes even jellyfish. I made the jellyfish patina a few years back, and I do not recommend it. Though even the jellyfish patina is rather tame when compared to what was served at Trimalchio's feast. During his gustatio, he had raw eggs, or what looked like raw eggs, hidden beneath live chickens. "Friends," he remarked, "I ordered peahen's eggs to be set under the hen, but by Hercules, I'm afraid they're about ready to hatch. Let us try them and see if they're still fresh enough to suck." We picked up our spoons, each of which weighed not less than half a pound, and pierced the shells, which were made of pastry. I broke open the shell with my hand and discovered a fine fat fig pecker embedded in a yolk seasoned with pepper. Absolutely wild. Now, Satyricon is a work of fiction. It is ancient, but it is a work of fiction, so sometimes the meal is probably a little bit more elaborate than in reality. However, we also have many descriptions of actual feasts that took place in Rome, and they're often just as elaborate and just as spectacular, because if you had the money, that was the time to show it off. Make these huge, spectacular meals. And you could definitely do that with the next course, the main course, the prima mensa, or first table. Now again, if you didn't have money, the prima mensa was going to be pretty simple. It might be some sort of stew or porridge or different marinated vegetables served with garum, the omnipresent fish sauce of ancient Rome. And then you could move on to maybe some sort of boiled or roasted meat with a sweet dipping sauce. But on the other end of the spectrum, if you had the money, then you could go with some of these spectacular dishes that you'd find in Apicius. Here it was all about the exotic meats like peacock and ostrich, parrot and flamingo. The most prized bit of the flamingo was said to be the tongue. The poet Martial wrote an epigram as a flamingo who lamented that epicures regard my tongue as tasty, but what if my tongue could sing? Alas, flamingos don't sing, they honk. Other exotic dishes, at least exotic to the modern dinner table, are things like sow's womb that's been boiled, or an udder of a cow that has been stuffed with sea urchins. They also had a wonderful dish of roasted sheep's testicles in broth. But from the actual menus that we have from antiquity, It does seem like these kinds of dishes were more the exception and not the rule. They were there, but most people weren't having them, at least very often. More often, the prima mensa consisted of dishes like roast sausages, boiled pork, and assorted vegetables. Though peacock does actually seem to be a rather standard fowl of the day, there's even a menu from an ancient tavern that says, "For dinner there is chicken, fish, pork, and peacocks." One menu we have from the time actually comes in the form of a letter by Pliny the Younger, who was the nephew of Pliny the Elder. And he was writing it kind of tongue-in-cheek, but he was writing it chastising a friend of his for not showing up to dinner. "What a fellow you are! You promised to come to dinner and then fail to turn up! Well, here is my magisterial sentence upon you. You must pay the money I am out of pocket to the last coin, and you will find the sum is no small one. I had provided for each guest 1 lettuce, 3 snails, 2 eggs, spelt mixed with honey and snow. You will please reckon up the cost of the latter as amongst the most costly of all, since it melts away in the dish. Olives from Baetica, cucumbers, onions, and 1,000 other equally expensive dainties. You would have listened to a comedian or a reciter or a harp player, or perhaps to all, as I am such a lavish host. But you preferred to dine elsewhere, where I know not, off oysters, sow's womb, sea urchins, and to watch Spanish dancing girls. You have grudged, possibly yourself, but certainly to me, a fine treat. For how we should have enjoyed ourselves, how we should have laughed together. You can dine at many houses in better style than at mine, but nowhere will you have a better time, or such a simple and free and easy entertainment. In short, give me a trial, and if afterwards you do not prefer to excuse yourself to others rather than to me, why then I give you leave to decline my invitations always. Farewell." Again, it is in jest, it is a joke, but I kind of feel like Pliny the Younger was maybe a little bit hurt. And frankly, who wouldn't be? Now, one of the dishes that he mentioned in his menu of dishes was spelt mixed with honey and snow, like actual snow. And this is essentially a form of sherbet or early ice cream, and it would have been part of the dessert or the secunda mensa. The tables, which had once held sow's womb and flamingo tongues, would be whisked away and replaced with another laden with apples, pomegranates, figs, dates, peaches, apricots, and other fruit. There would be walnuts and almonds and pine nuts and pistachios, and of course, different sweet cakes like the savilum. Other than perhaps more drinking and some games and discussion, the fruit and cake course, the secunda mensa, signified the end of the meal. Usually, because it does seem that there was a certain type of person who liked to have that at the beginning of the meal. In the letters of the statesman and Stoic philosopher Seneca, he speaks of a certain type of person who liked to show off, always needing to be the center of attention and make sure that everyone knew how much money he had. Kind of like a modern-day Instagrammer who's always posting pictures with private jets and Gucci bags. In this case, it would just be with fancy chariots and nice togas, I guess. But after they had spent all their money on those things, Seneca says that they would spend all of their money on furniture, too much furniture to even fit into their house. So then they would have to build a bigger house. And they would build these in town, even though the house was really the size of a house that should have been out in the country. And then they adorned these houses with just too much. It became gaudy. There would be way too much imported marble on the floors and gold along the walls. And then they turned their exquisite taste to the dinner table, attempting to court approval by novelty, reversing the customary order of dishes so that those normally served at the end of the meal are served first, and those foods which guests expect to eat at their arrival are offered as they are leaving. Can you imagine? So in that case, when you arrive at the meal, instead of getting eggs, you are given a slice of savilum, like the one that I'm about to eat. And here we are. Cato the Elder's recipe for savilum. Now he does say that it should be served in the dish that it's baked, but I think I put it a little slice just so it's better to see. He does say to eat it with a spoon, so that I will do. Dense. But flavorful. Sweet. It's actually quite good, but it is definitely the densest cheesecake I've ever come across. A couple bites and you're kind of done. But the flavor is wonderful. It's not as sweet, obviously, as a modern cheesecake, but it is sweet. And if you added more honey, it would be sweeter, but it is that honey sweetness rather than sugar, which is probably not what most people are used to today. But it's actually really smooth. While it's dense, it is nice and smooth. And I'm curious because kind of this crust got a little darkened. So I'm gonna just take a piece of that. I wish the whole thing was that. It's not quite as dense. It's a little bit lighter in texture, but you still get the flavor. I think that the cheese that you choose really does matter. If you want to use something that has more flavor than ricotta, by all means, just know that that is going to be the predominant flavor. So would I choose this over a New York style cheesecake? No, I would not. But it is good, and it's really cool that even 2,000 years ago, this existed. You can see that it is the early form of cheesecake. It's like a direct line. One of my very first videos was on a medieval cheesecake, and you can kind of see how it tracks throughout time. It's really cool. It's one of those dishes that has been with us for a long time and hasn't changed all that much. So get some cheesecake, whether it's ancient or modern, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. Growing up in Arizona and now living in Southern California, my belly is no stranger to Mexican food. And one of my favorite dishes is a simple quesadilla. Cheese, tortilla, that's about it. What makes quesadillas so interesting from a historical perspective is that they are the perfect combination of pre-Columbian cuisine and post-Columbian cuisine, meeting for one magical dish. So today, using a recipe from 1831, I'm going to show you how to make quesadillas cernidas, or sifted quesadillas. And we'll focus on the pre-Columbian ingredient, corn tortillas. Esta vez, en Tasting History. So I am totally geeking out today because I got to work on this episode with a historian hero of mine, Professor Ken Albala. Ken is a professor at the University of the Pacific and has authored many books on food history, which have appeared as sources here on Tasting History. Most recently, he created a series of videos for the great courses called Cooking Across the Ages, and I'm going to link to that in the description. You should definitely go check it out. He is a font of knowledge, and I'm just so grateful that he agreed to work with me on today's recipe from the 1831 Cocinero Mexicano for quesadillas cernidas, or sifted quesadillas. Take it away, Ken.
Sifted quesadillas. Put your corn to cook with water, being washed and let it dry. Grind it and sift. Mix with the dough a little melted lard, salt, and a little of the settled tequesquite so the dough is workable. Sprinkle with flour and form into a wheel, well flattened in the way you like, and put in the middle a little aged cheese or fresh according to the preference of each one. Fold over the edges so they stick. At this point, put them into very hot lard, bathing continuously, each so they puff up. Take them out and drain them and eat them fresh.
So it's definitely recognizable as a quesadilla, but it's also a little bit different than one that you'll find in a Mexican restaurant, at least here in America or most parts of the world. Those are usually made with flour tortillas and heated on a comal or just a flat surface rather than frying them. But these are fried in lard, and you can't be mad at that. Also, the recipe mentions an ingredient that I'm guessing most people haven't heard of. I had never heard of it, and it's called tequesquite. What is tequesquite, Ken?
It's basically sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate. It's like baking soda, basically. But it's got sodium chloride and sodium sulfate in it, so it smells a little bit like sulfur. Sometimes it's used to soften beans the way you'd use baking soda, but it's also a natural leavener.
So that explains why the recipe says these quesadillas should puff up a little bit. Now, we're going to make two slightly different versions. He's going to start off with full kernels of corn, just like the recipe says. I'm going to make a slightly easier version that is also mentioned in the book, which uses masa harina that has already been pre-ground. And if you're going to make them at home, I'm going to guess this is probably how you're going to do it. That said, you can actually just buy the tortillas, because the book also says you can go ahead and just buy them, because even back in 1831, they knew that making tortillas from scratch was kind of a pain in the butt. So first, let's watch Ken make sifted masa that the recipe calls for using full kernels of corn. So get about 2 cups of dried field corn and boil them in water for about an hour until they're mashable. Then strain them out and let them dry for a bit. Then comes the hard part. Ken uses a huge mortar and pestle to grind the corn into a paste, which he then pushes through a sifter to give him a nice smooth dough, hence the term sifted quesadillas. This is not a task for the impatient. So now, as I mentioned, I'm going to be using pre-ground dried masa harina, and it's going to be similar to what Ken has, though his still has the husks on it, and it's probably not going to be as fine. But other than that, the flavors should be similar, except for one important difference. My masa harina has been nixtamalized, and you're probably saying, nixtama what? And I promise I'm going to explain this magical process called nixtamalization later on, but for now, let's just get back to the quesadillas. So what you'll need for this recipe is 1.5 cups or 180 grams of masa harina. Now, masa harina literally means corn flour, but it is not the same as corn flour that you're going to get in the store. So make sure that you're getting masa harina or masa flour rather than corn flour. They're going to turn out very, very different. 1 cup or 250 milliliters of warm water, 1 teaspoon of salt, 2 tablespoons of lard, plus quite a bit more for frying. If you don't want lard, you can go ahead and use whatever oil you want, but I'm going to use lard. 2 tablespoons of tequesquite water. So how you're going to make this tequesquite water is you take about a tablespoon of tequesquite and pour about a 1/2 cup of boiling water over it. Then you let the tequesquite settle and let the water cool, and then you just skim the water off of the top. Don't eat the actual rocks at the bottom. Now, I read online that if you don't have tequesquite, you can use baking powder, though it is not going to do the same thing exactly, but it is going to give it that same puffing effect, hopefully. But if you want to use tequesquite, I have a link in the description to where you can get that online. And 4 ounces or 115 grams of cheese. Now, the recipe says to use either aged or fresh cheese, so that is basically every cheese that's ever existed in the world. So I'm going to use Oaxaca cheese, but you can use whatever you want. So first, add your salt to the masa harina and pour in the warm water and mix together until you get a paste. Now, if you followed Ken's lead and used full kernels of corn, then you don't need to add the water. You have plenty in there, so just add the salt. But from here on out, everything is the same. So next, add in your 2 tablespoons of melted lard and the 2 tablespoons of tequesquite water skimmed off the top. Then mix everything together. If you think the dough is a little too moist, then just add in some more flour, and if you think it's too dry, add in a little more lard or water. At this point, we're ready to make our tortillas. Now, you can either just roll them out with a rolling pin, or you can just make them flattened with your hands. But if you have a tortilla press, now is the time to use it because they're so fun. So roll your masa into balls about the size of a golf ball, and then form it into a tortilla however you like. I'm using the press. Now, with the press, you'll definitely want to use some parchment or plastic wrap to keep it from sticking. The recipe says to put a little extra flour on there to keep it from sticking, but I tried that and it didn't work. So once your tortillas are ready, it's time to do as Richard Simmons commands and melt that fat in a skillet over medium-high heat. And while that fat heats up, it seems as good a time as any to check out the history of corn tortillas. The word for corn tortillas in the Aztec language, nahuatl, is tlaxcali, and that literally means to bake. Ours are fried, so I don't even know if they count as corn tortillas, but I'm not going to think about that. Instead, I'm going to focus on that process that I mentioned earlier, nixtamalization, which every time I think about people just happening upon this process, it blows my mind. So let me break it down for you. The word itself comes from the Nahuatl word nixtamali, and it refers to ashes and corn dough. And essentially it was the process of cooking maize or corn in water that had either lye, which came from the ashes of hardwood, or lime, which came from ground up mussel shells. Cooking the maize this way would break down the outside of the kernel, then making it easier to grind into masa. What makes it even more mind-bogglingly amazing to me is actually the side effect that happens when you nixtamalize corn, which the people probably did not realize. And that's the fact that besides moving carcinogenic aflatoxins, always a good thing to get rid of, the process of nixtamalization also would allow niacin, or vitamin B3, to be absorbed by the person who's eating it. So Ken's version of his sifted masa hasn't gone through the process, so it's going to be very deficient in niacin. And that's fine, because by the 19th century, people in Mexico were getting niacin from other food sources. But before the Spanish came, the main source of niacin needed to come from corn because that was the staple of the diet. And if you're eating mostly corn for your diet, not putting it through the process of nixtamalization can lead to a host of diseases, including pellagra, which can cause horrible dermatitis, hair loss, and even dementia. So it's very important that they came up with this process, and it just amazes me because it is by no means universal. In the 15th century, when Columbus took maize back to Spain to be grown, he neglected to inform the people of the process of nixtamalization. And so it's not surprising that pellagra spread amongst the lower classes in much of Europe because they were eating mostly corn because it was cheap and easy to grow. And just like knowledge can spread, so can a lack of knowledge, because most of the places that Europeans then colonized had the same problem with this disease. The United States, the Congo, South Africa, India, in fact, still to this day in parts of India and China, the disease persists. So there's just one more thing that Columbus really kind of screwed up. Anyway, after the process of nixtamalization, the kernels would be ground mostly by women into masa using a cylinder-shaped stone called a mano and a concave stone base called a metate. We can actually see the process in a document called the Codex Mendoza, which was created around the year 1542, shortly after the Spanish conquest. Through the work of native Aztec artists, it documented the history of the Aztec kings, as well as the daily life of the people, including what they wore, how they fought, their religion, and even how they punished their children. Definitely more strict than my parents, much worse than a timeout. Maize is also mentioned in Hernán Cortés's second letter to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. It's also one of the first mentions of corn syrup. The city has many public squares in which are situated the markets, where are daily assembled more than 60,000 souls engaged in buying and selling, and where are found all kinds of merchandise that the world affords, embracing the necessaries of life, as for instance articles of food, honey and wax from bees, and from the stalks of maize which are as sweet as sugarcane. Maize or Indian corn in the grain and in the form of bread, preferred in the grain for its flavor to that of the other islands in terra firma. Now, it makes sense that maize would be featured in both of these documents because it was an integral part to Aztec life. In fact, for an earlier civilization, the Maya, it was life. Literally. In the Quiche Mayan creation myth, the gods literally made humans out of yellow and white corn. If only the Aztecs had known that, then they wouldn't have had to rely on the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl to get it for them. Legend has it that long ago during the fifth sun, the Aztec people only ate what they could hunt or gather, but they knew of a plant that grew on the other side of the mountains that surrounded them called maize. They asked their gods to move the mountains so they could go get to this plant, but their gods said that the mountains were too great to move. Finally, they asked Quetzalcoatl, who said that they were still too big to move, but he would use his intelligence to go get the maize for the Aztec people. So seeing a red ant scurrying toward the mountains one day, he turned himself into a black ant and followed the red one. After several days of treacherous, perilous travels through the mountains, he came out on the other side where the maize grew. So he went up and picked up a kernel in his little ant pincers and brought it back to the Aztec people, who were grateful, though I'm sure that some people were like, couldn't have become a slightly bigger animal, brought back a bag of corn, because we got a lot of people here to feed, so, but no, thank you. Thank you. And those mountains that surrounded the Aztec people would have been the Sierra Madres, so despite what Humphrey Bogart might lead you to believe, the real treasure of the Sierra Madre was maize. Because archaeologists have found that maize was being grown and made into corn tortillas as far back as 10,000 years ago. So while the cheese in our quesadillas might be relatively new, coming over with the Spanish from Europe, the corn tortillas have been around since the time of the Aztec gods, a perfect dish of New World and Old World come together, and I can't wait to get back to it. So once the lard or oil is nice and hot, take a bit of cheese and place it in the center of the tortilla, and then fold it over and pinch it closed all around the edge. If the tortilla breaks anywhere, just press that part down with your fingers as well. Then slip it into the lard, spooning some over the top as it fries. Now the recipe does not mention flipping this over, but the top never really got crispy. It got cooked, but never crispy, so I would actually suggest flipping it over after about a minute. It's going to get crispy on both sides, and it's just much better. Also, don't overfill it with cheese because the cheese will leak out and make a mess. Once it's nice and crisp and is puffed up a bit, take it out of the pan and set it on a paper towel or something else to let it drain. Then repeat the process until you have as many quesadillas as you like and eat them right away because in the words of the cocinero mexicano, they will harden and get ugly. En mi casa yo no permito quesadillas duras y feas. And here we are, quesadillas cernidas, or sifted quesadillas. Little palate cleanser. Okay, I'm ready. Let's give this a shot. That's mighty fine. Mighty fine. They're really, really crispy. And because of the tequesquite, I guess, they're a little puffed up. You know, when you bite into it, you're getting those air pockets and everything. It's really, really good. The cheese is like all melty inside. Don't use too much. I think it could definitely overwhelm it very easily, but it's absolutely perfect. And then the crisp shell, it's almost like a tostada shell. It is essentially absolutely wonderful. So what do you think, Ken? How are yours?
Can I just tell you how good these things are? Listen to that crunch.
So if you're enjoying Tasting History, make sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram, where I post pretty much daily, but once or twice a week I'm posting short videos called Facts by Max, which are historical stories that didn't necessarily fit into an episode, but that deserve to be told. So I will see you over there, and I'll see you next time on Tasting History. I've never met a mac and cheese I don't like. Whether it comes out of a blue box or is served with Gruyere and lobster, mac and cheese can do no wrong. And so I have high hopes for this 19th century mac and cheese recipe with the fancy name, macaroni à la reine. So thank you to Bright Cellars for sponsoring this video as we celebrate gastronomy's power couple, macaroni and cheese, this time on Tasting History. So if you look at early macaroni and cheese recipes, they tend to be very simple. Pasta, cheese, and butter. The channel Townsends did an excellent video on making one of these early 18th century recipes for mac and cheese, so I'll put a link to that in the description. But since John had already done the 18th century, I decided to move a little bit later to the 19th century when macaroni and cheese started to flex its muscles. And I found this recipe from 1845 for what I assume Eliza Acton thinks is macaroni and cheese fit for a queen because she calls it macaroni à la reine. This is a very excellent and delicate mode of dressing macaroni. Boil 8 ounces in the usual way, and by the time it is sufficiently tender, dissolve gently 10 ounces of any rich, well-flavored white cheese in fully 3/4 of a pint of good cream. Add a little salt, a rather full seasoning of cayenne, from half to a whole saltspoon of pounded mace, and a couple of ounces of sweet fresh butter. The cheese should, in the first instance, be sliced very thin. It should be stirred in the cream without intermission until it is entirely dissolved and the whole is perfectly smooth. The cheese may be poured equally over the macaroni, thickly covered before it is sent to table, with fine crumbs of bread fried of a pale gold color. Nothing too complicated in the process, and so it really comes down to what ingredients you're using. So let's start with the macaroni. Now you can make your own at home, but you might run into the same problem that Thomas Jefferson did. See, he actually wrote down a recipe for making macaroni along with a diagram of a pasta machine. And then he had one of those machines sent from Italy to America so he could have fresh pasta made for him. But he quickly realized that the pasta was inferior to that he had had in Italy and in France, and it all came down to the flour. He noted that the best macaroni in Italy is made with a particular sort of flour called semola in Naples. So he ended up still importing pasta from Italy, which is actually how most people got their pasta for a very long time. And so to be appropriate to the period, you're going to want a ½ pound or 225 grams of dried macaroni. The shape of which is really up to you, because at the time, macaroni could refer to pretty much any type of pasta. Eliza Acton even says that there is ribbon macaroni or lasagna, though the tube shape was becoming the standard when talking about macaroni. The one thing it would not have been is the elbow-shaped macaroni that we know today, because that wasn't made until a bit later. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you are choosing your pasta is that it's of a yellowish tint, by no means white, as one sees them when they are of inferior quality. So to prepare the pasta, she says to add a little salt and a bit of butter the size of a walnut to the boiling water before adding in the pasta. Now, she and other cookbooks from the time say to boil the macaroni at a full rolling boil for 3/4 of an hour. And that's after it's often soaked for an hour or more in milk or water. So I'm going to guess that they very much liked the pasta to be much softer than we often have it today, and the pasta was probably much thicker, so it did take longer to boil. Not entirely sure, but if you are going to boil it for a full 3/4 of an hour, that'll give you plenty of time to pop open a bottle of wine. You can start your cheese sauce. And for that, what you'll need is 10 ounces or 285 grams of white cheese thinly sliced. Now, many old recipes call for Parmesan, but if Parmesan be used for it, it must be grated. But as we have said before, it will not easily blend with the other ingredients so as to be smooth. Use whatever you want. I'm using white cheddar. 1 3/4 cup or 425 milliliters of cream, 4 tablespoons or 55 grams of unsalted butter, a half teaspoon of salt, a 1/4 teaspoon of cayenne, and a 1/4 teaspoon of mace. You'll also need some dried breadcrumbs. So first add the cream to a small saucepan and bring to a simmer. Then add the cheese and stir it in until fully melted, and then add the salt, the cayenne, mace, and the butter and stir everything in. And you can add more or less cayenne and mace to your taste. At the same time, put the breadcrumbs in a dry pan and set them over low heat, keeping them moving so they don't burn. And you'll notice it can take a little while to get those breadcrumbs to that nice golden brown that you want, and yet it takes almost no time to go from golden brown to burnt. Now, with the breadcrumbs, pasta, and cheese sauce all going at the same time, you might not think that this is a good time for a lecture on the history of macaroni and cheese, but here it is anyway. Pasta with cheese goes back at least to ancient Rome. Cato the Elder's placenta, which I've made here on the channel, is essentially cheese between layers of a proto-pasta called tracta. By the Middle Ages, a dish with many of the same components begins to appear, lasagnes. The 14th century recipes usually call for pasta to be layered with cheese and then sweet spices like cinnamon and sugar. And the English form of curry from around 1390 has a recipe that just calls for pasta, butter, and cheese, and they call it macarons. In the mid-14th century, in the Decameron, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote of the town of Bengodi, a sadly fictional place where on a mountain all of grated Parmesan cheese dwell folk that do naught else but make macaroni and ravioli and boil them in capon's broth. And he says they would roll the pasta down the Parmesan mountain where people would scramble to get their hands on this mythical medieval mac and cheese. Now, regional differences between macaroni also begin to appear. Naples, Genoa, Rome, they all had variations in the flour quantity, the shape of the pasta, and in their preparation. In 1465, Maestro Martino's recipe for macaroni romaneschi calls for it to be plated with good cheese, butter, and sweet spices. Similar flavors to the earlier recipe from England. And the macaroni connection between Italy and England is rather complex. It appeared in the form of curry in 1390, and then the first recipe called macaroni and cheese, or rather to dress macaroni with Parmesan cheese, appeared in Elizabeth Raffles' 1769 The Experienced English Housekeeper. But around that same time, there's a linguistic curveball thrown because in England, the term macaroni not only referred to pasta, but also to a type of fashion. Yankee Doodle went to town a-riding on a pony. He stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni. Every American knows that song, and by the end of the American Revolution, it had become a patriotic ditty, but it actually started off as a bit of an insult to the colonists. Some claim that it was a way to mock the colonists by saying that they were so uncouth that merely by putting a feather in their cap they thought that they were fashionable. But I'm pretty sure it was actually a way to attack their masculinity. See, in the mid-18th century, it had become popular for the wealthy young men of England to take their grand tour, which was a lengthy trip around the European continent with a focus on the splendors of the Italian peninsula. While there, they would develop a taste for the finer things in life, elegant fashion, sophisticated manners, and an appreciation for top cuisine like the Italian macaroni. And similar to the Finer Things Club from The Office, these young sophisticates became members of what was called the Macaroni Club. And when they returned to England, they wore their ostentatious outfits and their bejeweled wigs. And had there been a RuPaul's macaroni race 250 years ago, they might have become cultural icons. But that is not how it turned out. See, the style of dress coincided with a time where it was very popular to mock the wealthier classes, and the fashion just made it too easy. In 1770, the Oxford magazine declared, "There is indeed a kind of animal, neither male nor female, a thing of the neuter gender, lately started up among us. It is called macaroni." It talks without meaning, it smiles without pleasantry, it eats without appetite, it rides without exercise, it wenches without passion. They were ahead of their time, and the style was short-lived, and the term macaroni returned to meaning pasta. But again, any pasta. Especially in Italy, any shape of pasta was still called macaroni. In fact, if you look at the many paintings and later photographs titled macaroni eaters, they are almost always Neapolitans eating long strands of pasta with their hands, more like fettuccine or spaghetti today. And that may be what Thomas Jefferson saw when he visited Italy in 1787, though he had surely come in contact with macaroni being eaten with a fork when he was in Paris. When he moved to France in 1784, he brought along his enslaved chef, James Hemmings. And as Jefferson did his diplomat thing, Hemmings was learning the art of French cooking. He studied under several of France's greatest chefs at the time and is often considered to be the first American chef trained in France. And when they returned to America, Hemmings brought many of the recipes he learned with him, some of which Jefferson wrote down, like the macaroni. And I intend to do an entire episode on James Hemmings, but for the purpose of this episode, it's important to know that it was likely his macaroni recipe that helped make macaroni popular in the United States, because Thomas Jefferson pushed the dish on everyone. Shortly after he became president, Jefferson served a macaroni pie at a state dinner in 1802. Hemmings had passed away by then, but it was likely his recipe or a version of it that was used. And it's unclear if it had any cheese in it, and it wasn't actually a universal hit at first. One guest of the dinner, a member of the House of Representatives, Reverend Manasseh Cutler, said, "February 6th, Saturday. Dined at the President's. Dinner not as elegant as when we dined before." Among other dishes, a pie called macaroni, which appeared to be a rich crust filled with the strillions of onions or shallots, which I took it to be, tasted very strong and not agreeable. Another guest was Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark, and when Cutler asked about the onions in the dish, Mr. Lewis told me there were none in it. It was an Italian dish, and what appeared like onions was made of flour and butter with a particularly strong liquor mixed with them. So he doesn't mention cheese in the dish, but after dinner he says, "We drank tea and viewed again the great cheese." And at first I thought maybe he was talking about the macaroni dish, but no. Rather, it is a wheel of cheese that was given to Jefferson as a gift. And Jefferson kept it in its own dedicated room, and people would travel for days just to have Jefferson invite them to the mammoth room and see the mammoth cheese. And if you think politics is divisive now, back then even the cheese was partisan, as the man who made it said that when it came to the milk used to produce the cheese, no federal cow must contribute a drop. And that might explain why Cutler was such a grump at the dinner, because he, like the unrepresented cows, was a Federalist. Now, while Cutler might have not been wooed by the macaroni, most of the population was, because it starts appearing in many of the early cookbooks from America, including The Virginia Housewife or Methodical Cook in 1824. It was written by Mary Randolph, and it does have cheese. And the fact that Mary Randolph was a close cousin to Thomas Jefferson and spent time with the family makes me wonder if her recipe is not in some way influenced by a version that James Hemmings served 50 years earlier. Now, macaroni at this point was still mostly being imported from Italy, so it wasn't inexpensive. And so the dish, rather than calling it simply macaroni and cheese, would often be given more elaborate names, like macaroni à la sauce blanche or macaroni à la reine, like the one that we're making today. And even as the price of pasta started to come down, it was still generally known as a rather luxurious dish among the wealthy. But there was a concerted effort to change this. In 1855, Alexis Soyer, one of Victorian England's most celebrated chefs, wrote of vermicelli and macaroni. "Pray, Eloise, why should not the workman and mechanic partake of these wholesome and nutritious articles of food, which have now become so plentiful and cheap? Macaroni is now selling in London at 5 pence per pound, and makes 4 pounds of food when boiled." And it took a while, but eventually it did become accessible to the masses. But once everyone was eating it, it kind of lost its appeal amongst the wealthy, and so the fancy French-named macaroni and cheeses fell off of the menus of nicer restaurants, especially those in the northern United States. But in the southern United States, it remained rather popular, especially amongst the African American population. This is also where we start to see that divide between Southern soul food style of macaroni and cheese, which is made with real cheese, and the boxed version that's made with processed cheese. And for the evolution of that processed macaroni and cheese, we actually have to go to Switzerland, because both the macaroni and the cheese started there. It was in Lucerne in 1872 that elbow-shaped macaroni was first produced. And completely unrelated, in 1911, it was two Swiss food chemists who were looking for a way to extend the shelf life of Emmentaler cheese that came up with the first processed cheese. Basically, cheese takes a while to mature, but then once it is, it goes bad really, really quickly and can become poisonous if you eat it. And so they would melt it down to kill all of the bacteria and mold, and then add sodium citrate. That would keep the melted cheese from separating, and then it could be resolidified into a block of processed cheese. But did the Swiss put their elbow macaroni and processed cheese together? No, it took a Canadian to do that. James Lewis Kraft was born in 1874 and grew up on his family's dairy farm in Stevensville, Ontario. In 1903, he went into the wholesale business when he moved to Chicago and started selling cheese to grocers off of the back of a rented horse-drawn wagon. The issue was with cheese's short shelf life, he had trouble selling in bulk, and during the summer without refrigeration, he had trouble selling it at all. So doing a little research, he came across the same process that the Swiss had and melted it down and then added sodium phosphate, which seemed to work better for his cheddar. He canned the cheese and sold it in bulk all year round. And in 1916, he patented the process just before America went into World War I. That's when he sold 6 million pounds of Kraft cheese to the American government to be sent unspoiled to the front lines in France. The cheese business boomed. He expanded and bought Velveeta in 1927, but still, the marriage between macaroni and processed cheese had yet to be realized. But then the Great Depression hit. The story goes that during the Depression, Grant Leslie, a Scottish salesman working in St. Louis, Missouri, was selling his pasta, and to make it more enticing, would put a rubber band around it with a packet of Kraft cheese. Well, Kraft saw this and loved the idea and decided, we could do that. And in 1937, they introduced Kraft Dinner, a meal for four in 9 minutes for an everyday price of 19 cents. One box could feed a family of 4, or a max of 1. 8 million boxes of Kraft Dinner were sold that first year, and by 1943, 80 million boxes were sold, because during World War II, protein from meat and dairy were hard to come by. And that box of mac and cheese packed a lot of protein for just 1 ration coupon. It was also a quick meal for a time when women were working in factories and not at home cooking the complicated meals of years past. And even after the war ended, that quick meal was awful enticing, as one of the radio ads said, "Don't hurry, puff and wheeze, there's a main dish that's a breeze." Kraft Dinner first came in a yellow box, and in 1954 they switched over to the blue box. And as popular as Kraft macaroni and cheese is here in the United States, it's actually much more popular under its original name, Kraft Dinner, or now KD, up in Canada, where it's often called the unofficial meal of Canada. One thing I find interesting is that today we just take the packet of cheese and mix it with some milk and then the pasta and you're good to go. But in 1938, when it first came out, they actually had recipes to kind of spruce it up. And one of the first recipes had a pinch of cayenne pepper, just like the Victorian recipe that I'm about to eat. So once all of the components of the mac and cheese are ready, put the drained pasta into a dish or a pan and pour the cheese sauce over it, making sure everything is well coated. Then sprinkle on the toasted breadcrumbs and serve. And here we are, macaroni à la reine, fancy Victorian mac and cheese. Here we go. All right, straight off, my favorite part, the breadcrumbs. I could put like a whole loaf of breadcrumbs on here. They just add such a wonderful texture. The rest of the texture is like macaroni and cheese. I mean, very, smooth and creamy with the texture of macaroni. The flavor is really going to depend on what cheese you use, because I'm not getting a lot of, I take that back. I am getting some of the mace and and that cayenne, especially at the very, very end. It takes a second. At first, it's like all I'm tasting is the cheese. And it's wonderful, but like I said, whatever cheese you use, that's the main flavor. But then you get that mace and that cayenne. What's interesting is it actually reminds me of the rice soup in the Third Class Titanic video. And thinking back on that, the main ingredients, the flavors there were mace and cayenne. And it's kind of from around the same period. It's about 50 years later, I guess. But that's really interesting. Basically, instead of cheese and macaroni, it's rice and milk with those spices. So you should give this one a shot, or any of the other old macaroni and cheese dishes, and definitely put breadcrumbs. I'm gonna start doing that just on like Kraft macaroni and cheese, because that's really, really fantastic. So make a bowl of mac and cheese, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. A depiction of ancient Roman pizza has recently been unearthed in Pompeii. But is it really pizza? Well, kind of, and kind of not. Either way, I am going to do my best to recreate this 2,000-year-old dish long buried beneath the ashes of Mount Vesuvius. So thank you to Babbel for sponsoring this video as we prepare Pompeian pizza, this time on Tasting History. So just a couple weeks ago, archaeologists working in Region 9 of Pompeii uncovered this fresco showing a silver tray with a leavened flatbread with toppings, along with assorted fruit and a goblet of wine. Now the style of this painting is called xenia, which comes from the Greek word that referred to a sort of social contract between hosts and guests, part of which was an offering of food to the guests, and the ancient Roman author Vitruvius wrote about this style of art in the 1st century BC. When the Greeks became more luxurious and their circumstances more opulent, they began providing dining rooms, chambers, and storerooms of provisions for their guests. And on the first day, they would invite them to dinner. This is why artists called pictures representing the things which were sent to guests xenia. So even 2,000 years ago, there was art history. So figuring out exactly what is depicted in this xenia is a little tricky. The archaeologists are fairly certain on some things like the wine, bread, pomegranate, dates, and the fruit of the strawberry tree, or corbezzolo, which is the national tree of Italy, and despite its name has nothing to do with strawberries. But then there are also some more less obvious things like these items in front. Some have said that they look like mushrooms, though based on the art style, it's probably more likely that they are some sort of nut, but who really knows? Now, when it comes to the pizza and its toppings, well, it's kind of anyone's guess. Maybe that's cheese? Maybe bits of fruit? What's definitely missing is tomatoes, as those wouldn't even show up in Europe for another 1,500 years. And if there was cheese, it's very unlikely that it was anything like today's mozzarella, so while it may have some of the hallmarks of a pizza, I don't think it's going to be available for delivery anytime soon. Now, some scholars have suggested that one of the ingredients that probably is on this bread is sort of pizza-like, insofar as it is a kind of spreadable cheese, and that was called moretum. So that's what I'm going to be making today. Now, there are several ancient recipes for moretum, one of which includes pine nuts and is probably the precursor to pesto, but my favorite recipe actually comes from a poem because if you've watched this show, you know I love recipes in poetic form. The poem, often attributed to Virgil, is called, fittingly, moretum, and is really quite long, so I'm just going to read the parts that are recipe-like. Digging in the earth, he pulls up 4 heads of garlic. Then he desires the parsley's graceful foliage and the stiffness-causing rue, and trembling on their slender thread, the coriander leaf. And when he has collected these, he sits before the fire and loudly asks his wench for the mortar. The garlic bulbs he rinses and strips, then throws into the hollow stone. On these he sprinkles grains of salt, and cheese is added, then he introduces the herbs. The reeking garlic with the pestle breaks, then everything he crushes all alike. His hand in circles moves, until the ingredients lose their separate colors, and out of many colors comes one, neither wholly green nor shining white. Then drops of Athena's olive oil he adds, and pours a little of his sharp vinegar, and again works the mixture together. Like I said, there's a lot more to it, sometimes with erotic undertones, but that is the recipe portion of the poem. Now, something interesting is that the motto on the United States Great Seal, E pluribus unum, from many one, comes from this poem. Of course, instead of referring to 13 colonies becoming one country, here it refers to the different colors of ingredients being combined to make a new color. So a little different. And it's always interesting how language can do that, really be used in very different ways. Same language, very different meaning. German has a lot of these words and phrases, like Kummerspeck, which literally means grief bacon, but refers to the excess weight that you put on from emotional eating. Now, I wonder what the German word for Moretum is, but regardless, this is how you make it. You'll need 2 small heads of garlic, and I know he says 4, but I'm guessing he's making a massive amount of this because 2 is going to be very garlicky. A large handful of parsley, a large handful of cilantro or coriander leaf, a small handful of rue. If you can find it, it's not something you're going to just be able to pick up at the store. I'm growing it in my garden, so I do have some fresh rue. You can get the dried kind online. I'll put a link to that in the description. Though, if you or anyone going to be having this is with child, do not eat the rue. It is not good. In fact, if you just don't want to have it at all or you can't find it, just use celery leaf. It's similar. 1 teaspoon of salt, 10 ounces or 280 grams of white cheese. I'm using fresh sheep's cheese. That's hard to say, fresh sheep's cheese, but you can use any kind that you want. He's not that specific, but it does need to be white because he is specific about that. Then 1 tablespoon of olive oil and 1 tablespoon of white wine vinegar. So first peel your garlic and chop it up, then chop your herbs. And then he says to crush the garlic in a mortar. But he must have had a huge mortar because just those 2 cloves half filled up my mortar. So I very quickly switched to a food processor, and I suggest you do the same. Then add the salt and the cheese. There is no way this amount of cheese would have ever fit in my mortar. Then add in the herbs and blend until, as he said, the white of the cheese and the green of the herbs have become one. E pluribus unum. Finally, add the olive oil and the white wine vinegar and blend until smooth. Then set that aside as we make our bread. Now, exactly what this bread is very hard to tell, but it does seem that there is a depiction of it without toppings in another fresco from Pompeii. And it looks as if there's maybe some sort of trench running around just inside the edge of the bread, possibly to keep the food from falling off like a pizza crust. Those breads were sometimes called mensae, or singular mensa, and would be similar to the trenchers of the Middle Ages. They were just there to kind of hold your food like a plate. In fact, it means table. Mensa meant table. And these tables are referred to in another Virgil poem called the Aeneid. In it, the hero Aeneas is given a prophecy that he will establish a new city, but not before a deadly famine has come upon you. And the guilt of our blood drives you to gnaw round the edges of your tables, to put them between your teeth and eat them. Well, flash forward, and he and his men are now in Italy, and they're eating a rather meager meal of some fruit piled atop bread, and then they start eating the bread, and Aeneas realizes, look, we are eating even our tables. This is our home. So in a way, Italy was founded through the eating of pizza. Now, to make this version of ancient Roman pizza, what you'll need is 1 cup or 250 grams of active dough starter. Mine is from whole wheat, but you can use a regular batch of sourdough starter. Either will work. 2 cups or 475 milliliters of warm water. 4 cups or 500 grams of whole wheat flour. 3 tablespoons of olive oil. 1 tablespoon of salt. And 2 tablespoons of honey. Start by whisking the salt into the flour and then add your starter and the water. Combine these until somewhat incorporated and then add in the olive oil and the honey and work the dough for 2 to 3 minutes until everything is well combined. Note that you are not going to be kneading this dough like you would a traditional bread because you don't want it to puff up too big. It's still got to be a flatbread. Once it's become a nice cohesive dough, put a little bit more olive oil on the top and coat the dough. Then set a damp cloth on top and let it rise. And you want this to rise rather slowly. It's going to kind of depend on how active your starter is, but at least 4 hours up to overnight, like 10 or 12 hours would actually be preferable, but it'll probably need to be in a cool place to do that. In the refrigerator overnight will work, but eventually it will double in size. And then don't punch it down, again like you would a normal dough, but just gently take it out of the bowl and put it onto a lightly oiled surface. Now we're going to form this into a circle, and you can make one giant pizza, but according to the mosaic, it looks like it's like more of a personal pan pizza, so I divided my dough into fourths and then formed those into circles. And you can use your fingers to make that sort of trench around the edge of the circle, and then put a little bit of olive oil in there to keep that part from rising as much as the rest. Now you can bake these on a baking sheet, but if you want to more mimic that ancient Roman oven style, then you can put it on a hot pizza stone in your oven. Either way, you're going to heat the oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit or 260 Celsius, and then take that round piece of dough and set it on the stone. Now I very quickly realized that my ability to move round dough from one place to another into the oven is lacking. So I quickly started putting some parchment underneath the dough, just better to transfer it. Then you can bake it for like 2 minutes, and then the parchment will just come right out, and you can finish baking it on the stone for another 8 minutes. And while it finishes in the oven, let us look at what else the archaeology of Pompeii can teach us about ancient Roman baking. A cloud from the mountain was ascending. My uncle was now so close to the mountain that the cinders, which grew thicker and hotter the nearer he approached, fell into the ships, together with pumice stones and black pieces of burning rock. The courtyard which led to his friend's apartment was so nearly filled with stones and ashes that if my uncle lingered any longer, it would have been impossible for him to have made his way out. That was Pliny the Younger describing the hours before his uncle, Pliny the Elder, died a victim of Mount Vesuvius. He had gone there to save some friends of his who were trapped and could only get out by sea, and being the commander of the fleet in the area, he had ships. Now Pliny the Elder did escape that villa as it filled up with ash and pumice, but he died soon after on the beaches from noxious gases coming down from the mountain. But little did he know that that ash that was burying his friend's villa along with the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, well, that ash would also preserve those places better than perhaps any from the ancient Roman world. Cold comfort to him, but a boon for us 2,000 years later who can learn so much about ancient Roman life from those sites. From the city's gladiators to its brothels to, of course, its food. And speaking of brothels and food, hic habitat felicitas. Here dwells happiness, sometimes translated as here dwells good fortune. And those words are inscribed along with, of all things, a phallus, and then hung above not a brothel, but a bakery. Because happiness indeed, bread is good fortune. Bakeries, or pistrina, are all over the archaeological sites at Pompeii and Herculaneum, about 35 having been found so far. One of the most famous is the bakery of Modestus, which, when excavated in 1862, included 81 loaves of abandoned bread, the baker having fled the city with his baking still in progress. These loaves were the panis quadratus, perhaps the most famous bread of ancient Rome, which is depicted on several frescoes from Pompeii and is made of 8 sections formed by 4 lines, hence the quadratus. And I did an entire video on this bread way back when I first started the channel. I think it was just a few months in, so I'll put that, and you'll have to forgive the fact that I'm pretty sure I have no facial hair in that video. Now another famous bakery is that of Popidius Priscus, and it's because his mill room, where he has his giant millstones, is so well preserved. He had 4 large millstones made of basalt lava, and these were usually turned by donkeys. There's actually an ancient Roman poem called The Golden Ass by Lucius Apuleius Africanus that describes this process. The poem is about a man who happens to get turned into a donkey, and then it's his first-person narrative of life as a human turned into a donkey. And at one point he gets sold to a miller and walks into one of these rooms with the millstones. There numerous beasts endlessly turned millstones of different sizes, not only by day, but all night long the ceaseless turning of the wheels perpetually made flour. I was harnessed to the largest wheel, my head covered with a sack, and I was given a shove along the curving track. There are occasions where it was people doing this back-breaking work, though usually the stones would be quite a bit smaller. Either slaves or the impoverished people who would just do anything for any kind of work. Even one of Rome's most famous playwrights, Plautus, was reduced to doing this work after he lost all of his money in a shipping accident. He would take a hand mill, a quern, and go door to door asking people if they had any grain to be milled. But regardless, once your grain was milled, you could make it into dough. And at the bakery of Popedius Priscus, this was done in the next room over, where he had massive mechanical paddles that would do the kneading. In fact, at his and other large bakeries, there was almost nothing done by hand except for the shaping of the loaves and putting the stamp on them. These were sometimes called signaculum, and were like putting a logo on your product, but less for advertising and more for quality control. Especially if it was bread that you were really proud of, you didn't want other people's inferior bread to be confused with your brand. So you would put your stamp on there and say, this is Max's bread. Now, giving out quality bread was very important, not only for your business, but it could even get you into public office. There are numerous pieces of graffiti in Pompeii that are endorsing people for public office. And one says, I beg you to elect Gaius Julius Polybius to the office of Aedile. He gives good bread. Other election graffiti in the city includes endorsements like the chicken vendors request that you elect Epidius and Suetius as duovirs. And of course, the city's bakers and millers got in on the endorsements as well, because together they were very strong and influential groups, almost like trade unions of the day. And it really reminds me of that wonderful scene in the first season of the show Rome.
The Guild of Millers uses only the finest grains, true Roman bread for true Romans.
Just like this true Roman bread that should be ready to take out of the oven. So once baked, remove the bread and make sure it's got a nice color on the bottom, and then let it cool just for a moment before you spread your moretum on top. Remember to use just a little bit because it is very garlicky. My entire house smells like garlic right now. Then you can top it with things like white cheese, dates, pomegranate, or whatever else you thought you saw in the fresco. And here we are, the pizza of Pompeii. Now again, they probably would have just taken pieces off of here and just eaten them at first, take a date or pomegranate or whatever and eaten it, and then finished the bread and dipped it with some cheese and everything. But I did a little slice just cause, why not? Here we go. So garlicky, like to the point of spiciness when you have so much garlic, but it's actually delicious, but it is garlicky. I actually want to just try the bread because it does kind of overwhelm. I put too much garlic on there, or not too much garlic, too much of the moretum. That bread is so flavorful. True Roman bread for true Romans indeed, or for true Maxes. But I also think that like if you have it with other things, you can't see this, I'm trying to grab a, I've got some cheese on there, the moretum, and some pomegranate. That sweetness cuts through. That's the way to do it. Now, one thing that you'll notice is not on this is that ancient Roman condiment, garum. But I am finally making the long version of garum. It is currently in my backyard. It doesn't smell as bad as I would have thought. It's slowly digesting itself fish in salt. So that video will probably be out in the fall, I'm thinking, because it does need a couple more months in this hot sun. But yeah, and I recently made a t-shirt with "You Had Me at Garum," so I'll put that link in the description, and I'll see you next time on Tasting History, where I will have probably eaten all 4 of these and will be a few pounds heavier.